The soft glow of the white fluorescent light bulbs that hung across the ceiling provided a cool color form around the blank, empty, and gray concrete walls of the interrogation room. Little to no sound was present, with the sole exception of buzzing noise coming from the light bulbs. The area itself was just as empty as ever, only a few chairs and a table where in the middle of the room, despite being devoid of any kind of proper furniture of any sort, there, T-H-E-I-R, was one small blue penguin by the name of Pablo, who sat in one of the chairs with a blank expression on his face. His entire body was almost covered in bandages. Bruises and an eye patch was covering one of his eyes. As he continued to sit quietly in his chair, the sound of the interrogation room's door opening practically woke him up from his trance that he was in.
"Good morning, Pablo,"
a well-dressed police officer said as he entered the room with a female detective. Pablo only nodded slightly before looking back down at the table.
"Did you sleep well last night?"
The female detective, a bright orange fox with blue eyes and a painted pink claws, asked.
"No,"
Pablo muttered under his breath.
"I see, Pablo."
The female detective grabbed a small pen and notebook out of her pocket and began jotting down notes.
"Well, do you remember who I am?"
the detective asked. Pablo looked back up at the detective and then back at the cop, who had bright smiles on their faces, and tried to remember. However, he had only met her once, so he had a rather hard time remembering her name.
Sorry, I don't think so,"
Pablo said as he lowered his head in shame.
"It's okay, Pablo. I understand that it takes a while to remember names. Plus, with all those wounds on you, I don't think remembering names is too far up on your list," the detective answered. "My name is Detective Maria, Pablo, and over there is my partner, Officer David. Now, before we start with the interview, would you like to go somewhere more comfortable, Pablo? We only needed you in here so that we could run a few more tests, just the one, and scans in the lab."
Pablo looked up at the detective, smiling down at him, and shuffled a bit in his seat. He certainly wasn't very comfortable being in a large, dark, cold room, and the stiffness of the metal chair he was sitting on certainly didn't help. He gave... Okay, this is all one sentence, by the way. Certainly didn't help. He gave a small nod in approval before being escorted by the flipper to a much larger room down the hall of the police station. As they entered the room, Pablo saw that it was certainly better than what he had expected it to be. The room itself was painted a bright blue and pink pattern across the walls. Large pictures of various rides and cartoon characters were lined up in small rows, about 3 for each wall. There, T-H-E-I-R, where, W-H-E-R-E. Oh man, this is exciting. Multiple toys scattered throughout the room, with a large toy chest practically overflowing of various toys and games for children of all ages. However, one thing was sure to Pablo. He was much too old for most of those things. In the middle of the room, there was a sofa surrounded by 3 rocking chairs and a large wooden table in the middle of it all. Needless to say, it was a very well-made room. A lot nicer than that blank, gray, and lifeless interrogation room that he had been earlier.
"I don't want to be that kind of room anymore!"
Detective Maria grabbed a hold of Pablo's flipper and led him down to one of the rocking chairs and sat him gently as to not cause the already injured avian any more kind of pain than he already was. Once they were both settled down, the detective immediately pulled out a recorder from her pants pocket and turned it on.
"May 24th, 2013. Time, 2:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
Subject interview, Pablo." The detective spoke into the microphone part of the recorder. Pablo looked at the recorder with a hint of confusion on his face. Detective Maria immediately noticed this and said to the young blue penguin. That's it, that's the end of that sentence. "Oh, you don't have to worry, Pablo. This is just for our interview, that's all."
"Oh, okay, but..."
Pablo began, but stopped halfway through.
"What is it, sweetie?"
Detective Maria asked, concerned.
"Well, is that going to help find the guy who...
Pablo's eyes began to tear up as he started to sniffle.
"Killed my friends?"
"Yes, Pablo," Detective Maria said with a warm smile. "It will help us get the evidence for what we need to catch the person who hurt you and your friends. All I asked of you, Pablo, is to be honest with me and leave nothing out, okay?" Pablo sniffled once again, but was soon handed a box of tissues to wipe his eyes and blow his beak. After doing that, he smiled and nodded a yes before carefully lying back on the rocking chair.
Good, Pablo. Thank you for letting me do this, by the way.
You're very brave for doing this, Detective Martha said. You're welcome, Pablo said, smiling back. Y-O-U-R, of course.
Okay, so Pablo, I want you to start from the beginning of when this all happened,
the detective said as she placed the recorder on the table and pulled out the same notepad and pen from her pants pocket. Pablo took in a deep breath and then exhaled, and then he began to recollect his thoughts.
Well, it started about a week back, and me and my friends had just finished with the final day of school.
The sound of the school bell ringing for the final time rung throughout the halls of the elementary school like water on a beach. Oh, don't try for metaphors, dude. You can't even spell the word interrogate properly. Normally this sound would just be yet another time to go home kind of deal. However, this time it sounded like multiple angels singing angelic hymns at the gates of heaven. Almost immediately after the bell, every single child from kindergarten to 8th grade all let out a joyful yay! Countless paces of papers, pencils, erasers, and other school-related items flew into the air like confetti. However, in one classroom, room to be precise, the excitement for the now upcoming summer vacation could be heard over all of the other students in the school. Now, children, you have a wonderful summer vacation. I'm hopefully going to see you all again in a few months, said as she opened up the door for the Why is the name of this teacher not in the story? Almost within an instant, the Anitra crowd of children, practically ran out of the room like a stampede of water. Once the dust cloud, that is the children, finally cleared, Mrs. Park noticed that, it's Mrs. Park is the name. Mrs. Park noticed that only 2 of her students were still in the classroom, Pablo and Tyrone. They were both getting everything that the 2 of them needed and leaving everything else behind in a neat pile.
Well, Pablo, you ready to go?
Tyrone said as he zipped up his backpack.
Oh, you bet I am,
Pablo responded back.
You still coming to our camping trip tomorrow, right?
Tyrone asked.
Of course I am, Tyrone. I wouldn't miss it for the whole world,
Pablo said with a very high dose of whimsy.
Awesome! All right, now that we're all packed up, let's get out of here,
Tyrone said, running toward the door.
I beat you to it,
Pablo said, running after him. The 2 of them continued to run toward the door, however, not before they thanked their... It's great, good. Make sure to thank for teaching them. Oh, you're quite welcome, you 2, Y-O-U-R. You both have a great summer vacation, said as she ruffled the fur/feathers on both of their heads. With all that said and done, the 2 of them both walked out of the room and into the still crowded hallways. They both desperately tried to get themselves through the crowd of screaming and laughing kids. However, any attempts to try and get themselves even remotely close to the double doors failed miserably, with a Y.
Ugh, how are we gonna get through this crowd? Pablo said, concerned. Well, I guess we could try and... Hey guys, wait up!
Tyrone was immediately interrupted with 1 R by a voice calling out to them. Neither Pablo nor Tyrone could see who called out to them, but they definitely recognized the voice. They're hanging out with their friends Uniqua and Austin. And of course, I don't know fucking anything about this series, and I don't know which one of these characters is which. Uniqua and Austin and Tyrone and Pablo are all here. But we're gonna jump ahead. They're all like camping, it looks like. They're roasting marshmallows. Tasha is also here. There's a Tasha involved. Okay, now we get into the good stuff. So, all of the characters pass out for some reason. Let me see here. Once everyone was ready, Tasha's stomach started growling. So it looks like they went camping. They brought some marshmallows and stuff to toast with them. And when they woke up the next morning to toast the marshmallows and stuff, they found that the bag of marshmallows had been left open. However, Pablo noticed that the bag containing the white confectionaries was completely opened up. And so they eat the marshmallows. End of flashback as they all pass out. Everybody's dropping like flies. Pablo himself being the final one to succumb to unconsciousness. End of flashback.
That was the last thing that I remembered before I passed out, Pablo said as he fiddled with his propeller hat. You're doing very well, Pablo. Now a few questions. Do you believe that the marshmallows had been tampered with something? Maria asked. Most likely, although I don't know what it was.
It was most likely a sedative of some sort, ground up into a fine powder and put into your bag of marshmallows, said Maria. Oh, Pablo responded.
Flashback. Pitch blackness. That was the only thing that Pablo could see. However, his hearing certainly hadn't been muffled, as he had heard the sounds of groaning and small whimpers, with no H, coming from all around him. He couldn't tell where he was, but he did know that he was sitting down in a chair of some sort. He tried to remove the object that was blocking his vision. However, he quickly found out that both of his flippers had been tied down by leather straps. After finding this out, Pablo began to panic along with all of the others. He tried to speak up as well. However, a ball gag was tied directly around his mouth to prevent him from calling out. Panic slowly began to take over the young penguin as he began to thrash about in the chair. However, this lasted for but a minute before the sound of door opening and closing caused everyone in the room to fall silent.
Up already?
A deep gurgled voice called out.
Oh, I thought you all would have still been asleep by the time I got back, but I guess not. Oh well, just gives me more time to have some fun,
the mysterious voice said. Pablo could hear H-E-R-E, the man making his way toward him, judging by the sound of heavy boots hitting the floor. As the man got closer towards Pablo, the man let out a wet burp that, had not the bag been over his face, written in brackets, would have made the blue avian gag in response. Within an instant, the black bag that had covered the penguin's face was removed with a swift motion. Now the cabin itself wasn't really that bright. In fact, it was very dim. But even still, it took Pablo a bit for his eyes to adjust to the sudden light. However, once it had finally cleared, he was met with a horrifying face that nearly made him wet himself. There in front of him was the man. He looked to be about 6.5 feet tall. He was a very obese man, although not to the point of extreme obesity. He was wearing a pair of heavy black combat boots. He was dressed in a stained white-collared shirt and black leather-looking pants. His hands, or hooves, were covered with black gloves for meat preparation. However, the worst of it all was the man's face. Pablo couldn't tell what kind of species the man in front of him was. He certainly wasn't a moose or a kangaroo, due to the lack of fur on him. His facial features were also heavily deformed, or in this case, mutilated to some extent. His lips were chapped and cracking with dried blood caked around it. His gums were black and swollen with small pockets of pus and blood popping every time the man moved his jaw. His teeth, although few, with most seemingly of his teeth rotten to the nerve, were grotesquely crooked and sharp. His eyes were dull and empty, with no form of color to speak of, and even the way his eyes even were positioned on his face was definitely not normal. The rest of his face looked almost like a rotting corpse. Even if Pablo could scream, he knew for a fact that would only spell out trouble if he did. After some time, the man walked away from Pablo with a rotted, toothy grin on his face. This gave Pablo some time to examine the area more easily. The place that they were in looked like an old dilapidated cabin, not too big, space comma, but at the same time not too small either. The entire place smelled of death, with a heavy stench of blood in the mix of it all.
I kind of feel like that's part of the death smell, but alright.
The living room and kitchen were connected together. The living room area had the usual furniture and such, although covered in mold, rotting away or even torn to shreds. The kitchen, however, was absolutely filthy. The sink was filled to the brim with dishes covered in rotten food, with stagnant water flowing out of the sink and landing onto the floor with small plops. The floor of the kitchen was covered in various stains of all sorts, so much to the point that it was hard to even tell what they even were. 2 small light bulbs that hung in the kitchen area illuminated a small part of the kitchen area, but not a whole lot. Just a small part of the kitchen area. No. It was still rather dark in the cabin.
I see it's too dark in here. Let me go and turn on the rest of the lights.
The deformed pig-like madman walked back into a door that apparently he had walked out of earlier. Within a few seconds, the entire room was illuminated with a bright light, which nearly blinded Pablo at such brightness. But like before, his eyes adjusted to the light, and what he saw made his eyes widen with fear. All of his friends were all on various devices. Tasha was near another door in the kitchen, most likely a bathroom, tied down on a table like a medieval torture device, the rack, for example. Austin was in between both doors in the kitchen, his hands wire-tied together from the ceiling, and he was suspended at least a few feet into the air by his arms, plus he was blindfolded as well. Tyrone was sitting across from him in a chair that was similar to the one he was sitting in, although instead of straps there was barbed wire wrapped tightly around his wrist and arm. He seemed to be losing a lot of blood as his face was practically pale as snow, and Uniqua was tied down to the wall by the usage of various straps and wires wrapped around her from hands and feet. Pablo tried to yell out for help, but of course with the ball gag in his beak, nothing would come out. Everyone's faces, with the exception of Tyrone that is, looked scared and at the same time confused. The pigman walked through the door once more, carrying a small toolbox in one hand and large hunting knife in the other.
What are you gonna do with those tools?
Tasha asked, her eyes widening as the man opened up the toolbox with a few clicks.
Fun stuff,
the man said in a sick, perverted way. Tasha, in a fit of anger and rage, yelled out at the man.
You better let us go right now! I swear if you touch me or my friends, I'll beat the living tar out of you! You hear me? My dad is a cop, and he'll have your...
B-U-T,
arrested and thrown in jail in an instant!
While she continuing to yell out various calls and insults to him, the man's expression changed from sadistic glee to a hateful rage in almost an instant. The man shook and spasmed as his face contorted to one of pure hatred and wrath. The others, Pablo and Uniqua, noticed this as well and practically begged Tasha to shut her mouth, but she ignored them and continued on yelling, this time her tone getting more and more vulgar.
I swear to God, if you don't let us go, you fucking perverted freak, I'll personally bash my face into your...
Tasha's ranting was soon interrupted with the man turning to the yellow hippo, eyes red and angry.
Shut the fuck up, the annoying piece of shit!
The man screamed. Almost in an instant, the man lunged at Tasha and grabbed her lower jaw with both of his greasy gloved hands and began yanking it. Tasha screamed as the man yanked harder and harder on the younger child's jaw. Pain coursed through her body as the man yanked hard on her jaw, causing it to be completely unhinged from her skull, only connected by flesh. Tasha continued to scream in agony and pain as the others looked on in sheer terror. Finally, the man, with one heavy yank, tore the skin muscle clean off of the hinges of her jaw and tore the jaw from her head. Tasha was now in hysterics as she attempted to scream, blood pouring out of her now missing jaw like a fountain. The screaming soon was reduced to gurgling as the blood went into her throat. Within minutes of violent shaking, coughing, and gurgling, end of sentence. That's the end of the sentence. Her whole body went still, her eyes rolling in the back of her head. She had drowned in her own blood. The man just smirked and clasped and then dislocated jaw bone tightly in his now bloodied hand.
Glad that bitch was taken care of. I always hated her.
The man scowled. Everyone at this point had gone silent. Not a single word was said. Pablo was in complete and utter shock at what had just happened in front of him. Tears wheeled up in his eyes, and he stared intently at the jaw in the fat fuck's hand.
This isn't happening,
Pablo thought to himself.
Now, where were we?
The fat pig said, his perverted smirk returning to his now blood-soaked face. The pig man turned his attention towards Uniqua, who in turn began to cower and cry at the wretched sight of his blood-soaked face. The man gave a rotted, toothy smile at the pink ladybug before him, before turning towards his toolbox and pulling out a large spray bottle filled with a green liquid.
You know, Uniqua, never really did get what you actually are. I always thought you were an alien of some sort, but now you look more like a bug.
The man's smile dropped to a frown as he held up the spray bottle towards Uniqua's face. "And I hate bugs." With that said, the pig began spraying the liquid onto Uniqua's face. She screamed a high-pitched scream as parts of her face began to melt like cheese in a microwave. The man continued to spray her until, 2 L's, her face was nothing more than chunks of melted flesh and exposed skull. Despite all of that trauma she was going through, she was still breathing. The pig noticed this and tossed the bloody jaw up into the air and caught it with one catch. Then, he took the jaw and jammed it deep into her left eye socket, which penetrated her brain, causing instant death. The pig looked at his handiwork and laughed a sick, maniacal laugh, Pablo, at this point, was trying desperately to get the gag off of his beak so that he try and cry out for help. Oh, that'll help. That works so well for the first girl. It was working, however, not as fast as he wanted it to go out. The pig man, who now already stopped laughing at this point, then walked over to the now unmoving moose Tyrone. The pig man looked closely at Tyrone and then scoffed at a bit.
Damn it! I knew I had those wires tied too tightly. Fuck!
The pig swore.
Well, he's fucking dead!
The pig said, kicking the chair with Tyrone toward the side.
Although I still have some use for him.
The pig then walked back over toward the toolbox. I'm trying to figure out what the use is.
That he had brought out the toolbox and pulled out a small bone saw.
Bone saw is ready.
He then went over to where Tyrone's body was at and began sawing off Tyrone's horns one by one. The sound of metal against bone made Pablo want to throw up. To try and get his attention away from the carnage happening in front of him, he looked over at Austin. He didn't look any better than he did. The only difference was the amount of pain that the poor kangaroo must have been going through, having to be hung up in a position like that. He was honestly surprised that Austin hadn't started screaming in pain yet. Then again, his arms at this point must have been numb as all hell. The only good thing that Austin had, compared to him, was the fact that he couldn't see anything. He didn't see all the terrible carnage and violence that had transpired only a short while back. While thinking these things, Pablo was immediately snapped back into reality by a wet, squishy sound, followed by a small thump. He knew for an absolute fact that he didn't want to see what it was that made that thump. However, his body wasn't listening to his mind. His head slowly turned itself toward the source of the thump, only to be met with the hornless, skinned, and severed head of his once best friend, Tyrone. Pablo fought the urge to vomit because he knew that if he puked now, he'd most likely drown in his own vomit. So he just closed his eyes and quietly wept for his now dead friend, but at least his death wasn't full of pain and misery like the other two had been.
Let's see. So he puts the moose's head on the thing. There's an F slur that shows up at some point here.
I've been in this cabin for almost 5 years now.
So he decides to not kill his little boyfriend, whichever one that is, the kangaroo one, Austin. He decides not to kill Austin. He'll let the little boyfriend live, the pigman said. Thank you, please just... Pablo was cut off with another punch in the face.
I did finish, you fucking F-slur!
The pig sneered.
I'll let him live, but you have to do something for me.
Pablo looked up at the pig, who now had a large toothy grin plastered on his face.
What? Pablo said, shaking in fear.
I've been in this cabin for almost 5 years now, and like everyone else in the world, I need a release, you see. I've been hungry for some fun for quite some time, and...
The pig began rubbing his fingers into Pablo's feathers on his belly.
You're gonna help me with that.
Pablo didn't need to be told twice on what that sick bastard wanted to do to him, but before he could say anything, the pig wrapped the ball gag back into Pablo's beak. Then he got up and walked over toward Austin, and with that knife that he had used previously, he cut the blindfold off of Austin's eyes. Austin blinked rapidly, not used to the bright light, before his eyes adjusted and went wide at the carnage and gore that was around him. The pig smirked and walked back up to Pablo.
Now here's how it's gonna go out. You're just gonna be quiet and do exactly as I say, no questions asked. If you be a good boy, I'll never hurt your little friend over there, I swear it. Got it?
Pablo nodded as tears and blood poured out of his bad eye while regular tears flowed down the other. The pig man then shot a glare at Austin and said firmly,
You are going to watch this all the way through, and if you even so much as close your eyes for a minute, I swear I'll slit his throat and have you skull fuck him. Got it?
Austin nodded as well.
Good. Now let's begin.
Peer, 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 peer. He started to kiss me first and rub his hands all over me.
Pablo stopped himself. He felt like he was going to vomit.
Pablo, sweetie, do you need me to get the trash can?
Maria asked, concerned.
Please,
Pablo said, barely able to contain himself. And we have a character that shows up named Elizabeth. Not Elizabeth, but Elizabeth or Elizabeth. It might be with a Z or an S. It's hard to tell. But she shows up, and a rape kit shows up in this. This is Pablo's mom, I guess. This is Pablo's mom. When you do find that son of a bitch that raped, tortured, and cut up my son and his friends, you bring him to me and I'll make sure to castrate him myself with the dullest, flattest knife in my drawer. So yeah, this is like Special Victims Backyardigans. And it continues. This is just chapter 1, by the way. There's plenty more. There's plenty more. And I think we're good on that. I think that's all I need to read. You get the gist. You understand. You understand. That's the Backyardigans story. Playtime is over, ladies and gentlemen.